You won't believe what happens in this hidden stone room, a space heavy with imposed silence, a weight that settles upon the lungs and heart, transporting you instantly to a place where the air is thin and destiny is terrifyingly predetermined. Because inside, a girl sits on the cold floor, the rough Onyo wool of her skirt bunched beneath her, her hands folded precisely as instruction demanded, her small, measured breath momentarily clouding the air before it dissipates. A momentary sign of life, quickly absorbed by the monumental architecture of the Akllawasi, narrowing her entire world, tightening like a throat under the constant knowledge that the city keeps a meticulous ledger of all lives. As the state had already begun its careful accounting of who was chosen. Discover how an 8-year-old girl's identity was erased as she understands the procedure, her personal history being rewritten onto an imperial scroll, because when the regional Kuraka signed the Kipu and the high official the Apop Panaka sanctioned the list, her name immediately ceased to belong to the valley of her birth. Imperial functionaries meticulously measured her proportions, inspected her posture, and turned her face as if inspecting state property, searching for any imperfection with clinical detached fingers, while the mamakuna, the older woman who watched from the threshold, acted as an extension of the building itself, colder than the mountain wool, her duty being the inscription of obedience into muscle memory and silence into daily habit. A ritualized selection which was tragically the first step toward a terrifying certainty of service. The chilling truth about the Inca state's dark secret is how chroniclers such as Pedro de Cieza de León and later Garcilaso de la Vega described this selection with an almost procedural restraint, obscuring the immediate terror of touch and judgment. But for the young girl, the procedure was intensely immediate. The cold floor, the forced posture, the separation. This is how Pachacuti, the great reorganizer, who rebuilt Cusco in the mid-15th century, created an administrative state that expertly weaponized beauty, transforming youthful vitality into institutional tribute, making the Akllawasi system appear in state policy right alongside decrees regarding labor obligations, mita, and population transfers, mitmak. A mechanism that was as thoroughly administrative as it was deceptively theological. A perfect fusion of bureaucracy and spiritual claim. If you want to know the true power behind this system, you must understand this process was driven by relentless functionaries, not just by myth. The Apop Panaka were mobile judges traveling the vast royal road network to assess who would be fully incorporated into the imperial body politic, the literal human material to be consumed by the state machine. And so, the young girl quickly learned a new, rarefied language of posture, synchronized movement, and ritual chant. She learned the specific names of fabrics she would never be free to choose, and the strict geometry of the tokapu patterns that distinguished noble cloth to the ever-watchful mamakuna. She was merely raw, valuable material, and to the state chroniclers she was a potent symbol of compliance. Yet to herself she remained a lonely girl, silently counting the passing days by the number of imposed prayers and the vast, unbridgeable distance her thoughts traveled back to a valley she would likely never witness again. This is the hidden cost of the empire. In the confined yet bustling courtyard of the Akllawasi, individual faces were rapidly catalogued and subsumed by the scribes and overseers, making one day blend indistinguishably into the next, defined only by the rigid schedule of education and labor. The girls were forcefully taught to speak the standardized vocabulary of the state, adopting the formalized Quechua dialect of Cusco rather than the localized accent of their remote home communities, Ailu. And they were often assigned new names or titles that carried the weight of state identity but meant absolutely nothing to the mothers they left behind. This relentless indoctrination was designed specifically to sever the psychological tether to their origins, ensuring loyalty flowed only and completely toward the Sapa Inca. You need to know the dangerous ranks of the chosen. The girls were quickly divided into specific politically defined ranks, where those deemed less exemplary, categorized as Wairuru Akla were assigned rigorous manual labor. They would wash, cook, and weave coarser fabrics for local officials, sometimes being distributed as auxiliary consorts to lower nobility. But the finest specimens, designated the Uraka Akla, the white chosen, were retained for the highest ceremonial functions. These are the ones who were to be seamlessly woven into the tapestry of state diplomacy, high ritual, and the specialized technocratic machinery of imperial power, kept utterly pristine for ultimate consumption by the state. Here is the paradox of power. These highest-ranking chosen women became both the most visible and the most profoundly invisible figures in the empire, gracing the periphery of massive state feasts and producing the impossibly fine patented Quampi cloth reserved exclusively for the Sapa Inca. Their bodies were maintained as sacred vessels of state sanctity and purity. Later Spanish observers often drew flawed, sensationalist analogies to European institutions, but the functional effect was unmistakable. A massive bureaucracy that systematically sanctified service and consecrated the profound loss of individual freedom, demonstrating that the power of the state was enforced through the silent agreement of communities. In remote highland villages, mothers quickly learned they must maintain a difficult silence, a public display that resembled acceptance, because any sign of resistance or non-compliance risked immediate collective punishment. Local officials, the Kurakuna, explained the forced selection using the language of inescapable obligation. The vast, hungry empire demanded its due in bodies, just as it demanded tribute in grain and labor. And to overtly refuse the decree of the Akllawasi was to risk not just personal suffering, but widespread famine, or, in the worst instances, a focused purge of the community. The chilling true story you need to hear is that of a woman named Kuri, meticulously recorded by Garcilaso and other chroniclers, which circulated under the cloistered roofs of the houses of the chosen, serving as an ever-present, terrifying warning. Akla, who attempted escape or openly disobeyed, were not quietly sanctioned. They were transformed into public monuments to the severity of imperial obedience, and what came next changed everything. The harrowing account of a woman placed into a deep pit and slowly covered with earth until she succumbed to suffocation is one of the many punitive narratives intentionally propagated to translate abstract state law into immediate, visceral terror. These extreme punishments serve the dual interlocking function you must understand. First, they dramatically deterred any thought of insubordination within the system. But second, and more importantly, they demonstrated the absolute reach of the Sapa Inca, who demanded not only abundant harvests and forced communal labor, but also the intimate control and ceremonial service of the human body. The official state chronicles used a careful bridging language that fused legalism with high theology, asserting that the chosen were serving the sun god, and the sun was in turn the ultimate symbol of the imperial claim. The chilling truth about Inca power is that the Akla became a unit of tribute, and the specialized language of tribute aimed deliberately to obscure the devastating human cost to interpret the Akllawasi system as merely an act of elevated religious devotion is to fundamentally miss the cold, bureaucratic heart of the operation. It was a rigorous state policy demanding meticulous compliance, ultimately enforced through the potential or actual use of ritualized violence. Pachacuti's major reforms after 1438 are well documented. He expanded the road network, reorganized the provinces, and made Cusco into a highly centralized court, where constant diplomacy and surveillance were integrated into the daily routine. Why the Inca state needed human bodies? Centralized power must always possess instruments capable of touching the physical body, not only the distant fields. And the Akllawasi system served precisely this urgent need. It standardized the systematic collection of the most promising children, transformed them within specialized apprenticeship centers for ceremonial labor and world-class textile production, and kept the political elite consistently supplied with symbolic wives, sacred consorts, and crucial ritual gifts. A girl taken from a small village near the distant Vilcanota River may have been selected not for her family lineage, but solely for the aesthetic symmetry of her face, the absence of blemishes on her skin, or the proud carriage of her head, which suggested inherent health and good fortune. This selection process was designed to be ruthlessly intimate. You won't believe how personal the Inca statecraft was designed to operate on a terrifyingly personal level. Because the empire did not merely tax fields and harvest crops, it specialized in robbing individual futures inside the seclusion of the Akllawasi. The girl's education was exhaustive and absolute, where the mamakuna taught complex textile patterns known as tokapu, meticulously choreographed songs to the sun, the rigid protocols required for palace attendance, and crucially, strict and absolute sexual discipline. The presence of eunuch attendants, often men captured from outlying regions, was confirmed by Garcilaso's writings, acting as vigilant guardians, ensuring this demanded ritualized purity was constantly monitored and ruthlessly policed. Uncover the devastating contradiction of the chosen women. While this sheltered life was often materially luxurious and highly regimented in its fundamental structure, it constituted a highly specific form of slavery. Personal agency was completely suppressed in favor of a dominant state narrative where the girl's very being was transformed into an object of piety, making the resulting contradiction both simple and profoundly unsettling. The women who were the most venerated and symbolically important were simultaneously the most profoundly unfree individuals within the entire state structure, as their value was always contingent upon their ritual availability to the empire. This system was always a calculus of strategic value, and a kala might be deployed as a critical diplomatic gift to secure vital alliances with powerful neighbors, or distributed among provincial elites to bind their loyalty tightly to the Sapa Inca's person. Her ultimate fate was nothing more than a specific ledger entry in a vast economy of state power. But when the vast empire sought ultimate divine favor, a safeguard against famine or drought, it reached beyond mere diplomacy and into the chilling realm of human sacrifice. If this story made you reflect on the fragility of power, stay with us for the next chapter to see how deep the ritual control went. What really happened on the highest peaks of the Andes? The Capacocha. The royal obligation is the most formalized and terrifying example of this state-sponsored ritual, and modern archaeology has definitively corroborated the sparse skeletal accounts sketched by the chroniclers. Children and adolescents, often Akkalas, were meticulously prepared and led up high peaks, sumptuously decorated, sedated, and permanently entombed. Johann Reinhardt and his teams located several of these perfectly preserved remains in the late 20th century on summits exceeding 6,000 meters, the world's highest known sacrificial sites, providing undeniable, chilling proof. The chilling forensic proof of the Inca's ultimate sacrifice. The bodies of the Lalayaco children and the famous Maiden of Amparo are tangible forensic proof, and these spectacular finds reveal clothing woven using intricate imperial techniques, ritual bundles placed with extreme deliberation, and offerings arranged precisely according to a sophisticated theological script. The preservation caused by the extreme cold gives us the chilling details. The preserved flesh, the finely braided hair, the textiles all speak in forensic detail about a ceremony that perfectly combined meticulous preparation, high state theater, and absolute unwavering belief, confirming the girls were not random or anonymous victims. How the Inca prepared the chosen for death. Honor in this specific historical context was tragically inseparable from utter annihilation, and scientific analyses have provided us with a precise chronology of the preparation phase. Isotopic studies and hair chemistry reports consistently reveal distinct dietary changes, an increased consumption of maize and llama meat, followed by a dramatic spike in the intake of coca and chicha, fermented maize beer. In the final weeks, substances used deliberately to sedate, numb, and steady the victims for their long ascent. Confirming this entire process was precise and horrifyingly deliberate. The technical precision of Inca sacrifice will shock you. The specialized process of the capacocha, as reconstructed by researchers working on the Huelaco finds, appears overwhelmingly deliberate and highly technical, anything but chaotic, because the powerful state consciously invested enormous resources to ensure that its highest offerings were maximally persuasive to the gods. The long ceremonial ascent, the valuable funerary goods, the precise placement within ritually prepared caverns or mountain shrines, all confirm that this was a high-level sacrificial system, conducted by elite priests and state officials, working with the exacting logistical precision of the imperial state. If this unsettled you, you're not alone. So walk further into history's shadows with us. The brutal final moments of the capacocha reveal the shocking efficiency of their ending. The final mechanics of a high-altitude burial are brutal in their efficiency. The chosen child, draped in the finest finery and looped with significant ritual tokens, was carried in a solemn procession accompanied by high nobles and attendants. The arduous path to a 6,000-meter summit was itself a test of survival. With a dangerously thin air forced the young body, already fragile and sedated, into an immediate struggle for life. In the carefully prepared peak chamber, the offerings were placed, and the victim was seated or laid in position, sometimes supported by cushions, sometimes sealed within a tightly constructed stone compartment. Forensic evidence contradicts the chroniclers' assumption of quick, peaceful deaths, instead revealing traces of slow endings consistent with extreme hypothermia and slow asphyxia. The true violence of the Inca system. The body would cool rapidly, preserving the delicate organs and allowing modern pathology to reconstruct the last isolated hours, demonstrating it is unnecessary to invent nefarious violence beyond the structure itself. The structure. The cold, isolated chamber on the highest peak was the violence alone. Inside the stone compartment at the summit, a human life would slowly wind down, its ending dictated and chosen by the highest officials of the state. These rites were universally described in the language of profound piety by the rulers who instituted them, framed as necessary gifts intended to stabilize crucial weather patterns, ensure agricultural fertility, and maintain cosmic order. While genuine piety was undoubtedly real for many, the state simultaneously enmeshed religious justification with cold, hard political control. Because the selection of bodies for such dramatic sacrifices served a profound political purpose. It visibly demonstrated imperial reach. Officials traveled to the most distant provinces, selected girls based on specific defined physical criteria, and carried them to the perilous heights where the living could not easily retrieve them, making the effect powerfully demonstrative. The empire claimed the unique ability to place its own people among the heavens, thus claiming ultimate cosmic sponsorship for its own earthly rule. It was theology seamlessly blended with calculated public relations. The dual vision of the chronicles is incredibly revealing. Cieza de Leon meticulously recorded the administrative procedures and lists of tribute, while Garcilaso, writing later and with a perspective sympathetic to the Inca nobility, softened certain explicit details but could not completely erase the underlying mechanics of consumption. Other sources, such as Pedro Pizarro, describe the horrific custom of retaining cohorts for the deceased Sapa Inca with attendants and favored women entombed alongside their rulers, and all these accounts converge on the same simple, chilling fact. The state required human accompaniment for its political theater, implying that faithful service was quite literally final. This is how the empire began to collapse. The death of Huayna Capac around 1527, coupled with the initial ripple of virulent Eurasian diseases, had already begun to destabilize the highlanders. Smallpox, spreading rapidly through trade networks, decimated populations and set the empire on a catastrophic course toward instability. And the internal breakdown only intensified the cynical use of the Akllawasi. The state, weakened by disease and later by civil war, nevertheless maintained the brutal rituals that continued to consume bodies as it desperately sought to reassert its legitimacy through shows of profound piety, often with increased cruelty. The moment everything changed was with the turbulent, fractured landscape where the small force of the Spanish conquistadors arrived. Francisco Pizarro's violent capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca in 1532 was a definitive pivot point, and while the Spanish chroniclers focused on the spectacular violence and confusion, there was a secondary effect rarely emphasized: the sudden disruption of the ritual machinery, the complex logistical system that moved the selected girls from distant villages to the secure Akllawasi and ultimately to the high summits, was entirely dependent on the continuity of centralized imperial authority. Conquest did not immediately stop the ancient practices, but it instantaneously created openings and critical ruptures in Cusco around 1532. Many Aklas suddenly found the facility locks unlatched, the strict mamacunas absent, and the eunuchs either fleeing or already dead. The city itself was burning, and with it some of the physical ritual infrastructure that disciplined those inside the sacred prisons. Chroniclers noted moments of unplanned liberation, with Cieza de Leon writing that some of the chosen women actually sought refuge with the Spaniards, fleeing their sacred prisons, not into absolute freedom, but into a starkly different form of violent servitude. For many of the chosen, the choice became agonizingly stark: remain within a collapsing imperial system that guaranteed eventual annihilation in the name of the sun, or enter the unknown, brutal uncertainty of colonial rule. The Spanish camp offered, at the very least, a near-term future where death by state ritual was not a pre-scheduled certainty. The image of these young women running toward the conquerors complicates any simple moral binary. It illustrates that agency sometimes manifests as choosing the demonstrably lesser of two immediate violences. Because the system was fundamentally designed to leave no humane options. Consider the tragic legacy of Quila, a name that appears in scattered colonial parish records as a converted indigenous woman in Lima decades after the conquest. An archetypal survivor of the Akllawasi. Taken at 8 and educated for 6 rigid years, she was released into a city reborn under the brutality of new authority. Her surviving records are sparse. A baptismal entry, an intermittent mention in an encomienda labor account, a death recorded at age 29, cause listed as consumption. And these cold notations chart a life that decisively escaped the tidy, predetermined narrative of either sanitary piety or heroic resistance. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. Because the history of the Andes is complex, and this account relies on the convergence of archaeological, forensic, and documentary evidence, the truth is simple and profoundly heavy. An empire systematically remade the bodies of the most vulnerable, often young women, into critical instruments of its sacred and political authority. That truth demands a patient, precise account, refusing the easy comfort of romanticism. The last sound we leave is a factual echo. Institutions that sanctify oppression make atrocities appear meaningful. If this made you question the past, you're welcome to continue the journey with us.